Today we'll be talking about views part 2, stuff that I couldn't cover last time I was here. And then, depending on time, we will be talking about filtering and aggregation. My guess is that we will not do a lot, and then I'll adjust the schedule, and the next time I'm actually speaking, we will talk about filtering and aggregation in detail. So we will definitely not finish this. Maybe we'll get to filtering, but probably not to aggregation. One thing that I wanted to do today is to review the exam. I want to go through all of the questions that were asked and all of and the answers, at least my interpretation of the answers. And you're welcome to ask questions about the exam. I'm gonna have it done I'm gonna have it graded probably by tomorrow. So you should get your grades tomorrow or Thursday. It will be the same as for the homeworks. I will send out individual scores for every single problem, for every single question, on a scale of 1 to 10, and a combined score, and then you will have a total of maximum of 130 points, and then I'll send you your, let's say, curved score in addition to that, so you will get 15 numbers in total. And essentially this tells you about every single questions, how well you did on the question. Then you can see your overall points, and then you can see where this leads you. And the overall grade will again be on the 1 to 10 scale. So if you have a 9, that's pretty good. If you have a 7.5, that's like a C. If you want to review your exam with me, you can do this in Thursday's office hours and in the office hours in 2 weeks later. So you just can come to my office hour, tell me your name, I'll go through you with your exam if you have any questions. Okay, so this one almost everybody got right. Selectors. So the question here was, we have an HTML snippet, and show me 3 ways how can I select this rectangle here. And so this would be, like if you just wrote this here, you would have gotten full marks, because many of you gave JavaScript options of different ways of selecting things and so on. I also graded that as correct, of course. So like the obvious one would be to add an ID to the rectangle and then select based on the ID, to add a class to the rectangle based on the class, or use this ancestorial relationship to select it, or use this nested relationship to select this. So as I said, most of you guys got it right, and yeah, a lot of you wrote JavaScript, which was maybe not so great in the question phrasing. Any questions about this one? Okay. So what is the difference between a DOM and the DOM and an HTML file? Here, like everybody, or almost everybody knew what a DOM was. The key part here was that the DOM is a hierarchical representation that can be manipulated dynamically. So the DOM is something that is essentially represented in the browser as the browser renders the page, and you can change the DOM dynamically. You can manipulate this via an API or a library. So if you essentially mention this here and contrasted this to like HTML as a file format, or a markup language actually, it's not a scripting language used to structure documents. So if you told me this one, and this one here, you got full marks. It can be interspersed with styling and scripting language to dynamically generate DOM content, but the scripting language isn't really part of HTML. Questions about this one? Okay. This one was also, like many people got this right. So I really was interested in what are the values of A and B in this order of execution. I didn't use D and I, which probably like most people were more familiar with, but this was intentional just to show that A and B here are like, it's just about the position of the arguments. The correct answer was this one, 127, 61, 256, so the values in the array, and then 0, 1, 2. So a couple of people had 1, 2, 3. Okay, you didn't lose a lot of points for that. A couple of people actually gave me the return value here. You also didn't lose a lot of points for that. The second part of this question was, what happens if the SVG is empty? The answer to that is nothing, and almost everybody got that right. And you can fix this by adding enter and append. Again, almost everybody got that right. So this question, what is the idea behind scales in D3? So scales are a function that map an input, the domain, to an output. They make it easy to map varying data sets for consistent results, and they make it easy to map data to color scales. And they work equally well for continuous and categorical data. So here, essentially, when you told me that you want to transfer some data set into screen coordinates and so on, you got most of the points. So if you mention everything here, with the exception of, like, if you only stick to just numerical data, I think there is something important missing about scales. So if you also talk a little bit about ordinal data or categorical data, or about color scales, you get full marks on this. This one actually, surprisingly, I haven't seen a single one yet who got that right. This was in the first slide deck, and it's there were a lot of interesting answers, like when you have no data, yes, sure, or when you have data that you can trust, and so on. So you got I gave a couple of points for this, but the gist here is really if you have a well-defined question on a well-defined data set, you don't need visualization. And that was what I was really aiming for. If you have a well-defined question and a well-defined data set, just use an algorithm. So who is the tallest person in the class? Assuming I know all of your heights. I don't need visualization for that. I just can run a simple search algorithm and then have a number. And that's all that I need. In contrast to what is the distribution of heights in a class, or are there any interesting patterns, these kinds of questions are less well defined. So here I definitely need visualization. So that was what I was shooting for here. So the second answer was that I mentioned in the introduction is when a decision is needed in minimal time. Visualization involves a human, and humans are not as fast as in processing as computers, obviously. So therefore, when the human is too slow to make a decision in a sensible time, then visualization doesn't make sense. Given how many people got it wrong, if you mentioned only one of those two, you got full marks. The data types, like was this example, mark up the following things: attributes, items, semantics, keys, data types. Yeah, so let's go through that again. We have the items, which are essentially the values in the rows, and they're also called elements or independent variables. Then we have the attributes or dimensions or dependent variables or features, but for our purposes, it was only we only talked about attributes. So of course, all of these here are every single column here is an attribute. The semantics essentially are defined by the columns. If you wrote down that the semantics are not clear from a table because they need some extra knowledge, I would probably also have accepted that. The keys was the tricky question, kind of. The keys are in this case not the order ID, because the order ID is not unique, but it was the index of the table. The attribute types, the various ones, so we had categorical, ordinal, and quantitative. This is a little bit unintuitive. The order ID is categorical. Then here this is numerical. Many people said this is ordinal. Dates are interval, but not ratio, for the next question, but they're definitely quantitative. So it's a number, and it's you can say it's 2 days later. Order priority, this is ordinal. Product container is ordinal. If you told me this is categorical, I would have also said yes, because there is the red bag. Well, you can argue that it's smaller than the small box, but if you made that argument that it's categorical, I would have accepted that. And quantitative, again, almost everybody got it right for the product-based margin, and many people, again, give this as ordinal. This one here, the data type examples and properties, was related to this question. So the examples here were, for example, shirt sizes, temperature in Celsius, centigrade, or in Fahrenheit, or date for interval data. So here really the distinguishing factor, and this is actually wrong here. So 0 is arbitrary here, so this is a typo. The defining factor, or the defining characteristic of interval data is that we have a like a non-sensible 0, that we have an arbitrary 0. And therefore, you can do all of this, like test equality, test order, you can add and subtract it, but you can't divide and multiply it. For ordinal data, almost everybody got that right. Many people weren't quite sure about this one here. For ratio, you can do everything, of course. What is preattentive processing? Which properties are preattentive and how can it be used in visualization? Again, many correct answers. So preattentive processing is really about the perception, the part of the perception that detects elements very rapidly, that happens before the focused attention. So in this case here, we see this dot here preattentively, we see this dot here preattentively because of its different shape, and we see this one here preattentively again. So hue, shape, size, orientation, curvature, density, and so on. And why are you interested in it for visualization? Well, it can be used to draw the attention to areas of interest and to express similarities between groups and group memberships. So for example, brushing. Like if you want to brush or highlight something, then you can use these preattentive variables to do this. So what distinguishes magnitude and identity channels? And then list them list and sort them in order of effectiveness. So magnitude channels are used for ordinal and quantitative data. Identity channels are used for categorical data. Magnitude channels can express a quantity and an order. And identity channels can only identify elements and inform about equality. Yes?
I just have a question with the 0.
Yeah.
The question before. I think I'm looking at the slide that you have. This says the interval has an arbitrary 0 and then ratio has a true 0.
Yeah, so this is correct. This is wrong here. I mentioned that.
Oh.
So this is a typo. This should be yes. Okay, so we were here at magnitude channels. So magnitude channels can express quantity and order. Identity channels can give you information about equality. So you can only check whether two elements are equal, and of course you can identify them. And so, of course, magnitude channels map to ratio, interval, and ordinal data, and identity channels map to categorical data or nominal data. So, surprisingly, like most of you got it right, but surprisingly few mentioned position. So many people mentioned length, which is of course correct, so we didn't ask you for the most important one, but I was just surprised how infrequently I saw position on a common scale. So position is really the strongest one, and it's important to know here. Then position on an unaligned scale, then length, tilt, area, depth, and so on, luminance, saturation, curvature, and so on. So for the identity, there was spatial region. Again, very few people mentioned that, but almost everybody mentioned color and shape. And if you got the order wrong for color and shape, I didn't deduct any points because, like honestly, I don't think there's a very strong effect here. Yeah, this was the second question that almost nobody got right. So the two ones, like here, the Stephen's Psychophysical Power Law and one when not to use visualization, I think have an average of 2.2 or something like that. Yeah, I guess this was difficult because it was a name and it was only briefly mentioned in the slides. I thought that if I write Psychophysical Power Law that some people would get it, but yeah, well, I should maybe have spent a little bit more time in it. This is really important though. It essentially tells us about the relationship, about the perceived sensation and the physical intensity of a stimuli. So this is really important because you can derive essentially everything about the visual variables, or almost everything about the visual variables, just from looking at this chart. So you can make arguments about the ranking, about all of these things here, just by understanding what is going on here. And the key, of course, is that length is equal in terms like linear, is there's a linear relationship between physical intensity and perceived sensation. And there is a low relationship for brightness, and I guess if I mentioned electric shock in the question, people would have gotten it more frequently. Okay, then this one here, quite a few people got it right, but not everybody. Are small multiples an example of same or multiple views? What is the difference between the two? The answer is small multiples are the same views, and we will talk about this later today, again a bit. But same views is really like each view uses the same visual encoding, but shows a different subset of the data. So that's what small multiples do. We had these examples of graph attributes, so we had little pictures of the same graph, the same topology of the graph, but the nodes were colored differently. So that's a classical same view, small multiple view. Multiform views, as some of you mentioned correctly, is what we did in the homework. We have different visual encodings that are used between the views, and the idea here is that we have like a single monolithic view has strong limits on the number of attributes and on its properties, of course, that can be shown simultaneously. Okay, any questions about single multiform? I'll have a couple of slides like repeating from the last lecture that I taught. Here the number is wrong, it should be 12, but what is the degree of interest function? What is it used for? So this is again a very important concept. The degree of interest function tells us about, it's a focus and context idea. So if we have too much data to show at once on the screen, we could either just filter or aggregate, but we could also do something like this with this degree of interest function, where we have some idea of some elements in our data set are more important than others inherently. And then this also takes into account user interaction. So the two terms here are a priori interest of x and the distance of x to y. So the assumption here is that y is currently selected, for example. And if x is very close to y, then it's important. And if x is globally very important, then it's also important. So you would get this essentially combined score for every single element. Should I show it or should I not show it based on its a priori importance and based on its distance of a currently selected element. Yeah, so any questions about this? Okay, so the last question was the design critique, and here essentially I gave full marks whenever you made arguments. I didn't judge your ethics. Yeah. So the reason I picked this chart is, of course, I wanted to see that people kind of understood what we're doing here in class with the many design critiques. So there were a couple of like hard questions in here. So what is the data shown in the visualization, which was easy. Marks and channels are used. The marks and channels, of course, if you said area, that was okay. I kind of would probably say pixels or points would be the marks and colors would be the channels, and of course the pie chart here. So angle and color. So these were kind of the hard, the formally correct or wrong questions. But then, of course, are there any ethical implications of this chart? Really, I wanted to see some, like, you think about it. And so, does anybody want to say something about ethical implications, or whether you think this is a fair depiction? Any opinions?
I think that since the division is completely arbitrary, this 50%, you could also shade one half of the country versus the other.
Yes.
Like the East Coast would have one side and then the other. So.
Yeah.
I was almost feels like it's saying that some part of the country are contributing more to the total GDP than other.
Yes.
Doesn't feel very nice.
That is kind of what I think what is the main ethical thing here. So, like, here somebody picked very population dense places, and essentially this is not really. It is a map of GDP, but it's really a map of population density. Of course, there's some variation, so like this is really just telling us somehow this small part in orange is kind of like pulling the weight of every lazy slacker in the blue areas here. And that's kind of like not a super, like sure, it's correct. Well, I assume that this is correct, I couldn't really test it, but this is correct, you can divide the data like this, but it doesn't mean that you have to think of it like this.
Yeah, so I talked about how there's similar things for like Republicans versus Democrats.
Yes.
And then like a more correct or a fairer one shows like the region absorbed by the population nicely.
Yes, exactly. Any other comments about this chart? So one other like InfoVis theoretic argument that you can make why this is a bad chart is because it uses a map, and the map really, because you use a combination of map and population essentially. The map, as we have discussed many times, is not really a great proxy for showing data about its underlying population, for example, because you get all of this distortion like in densely populated states versus in less densely populated areas. So if you're interested, you can actually Google for this Reddit, and there was a lot of discussion on the internet about this map, and that's also why I picked it. Okay, any other questions about the exam? Or the midterm? If not, if you have any complaints about your grade, or if you just want to look at how you did, just come to my office on Thursday. Okay. So depending on, I'm actually leaving for a flight on Thursday, so I might actually have to cut it short by half an hour, but I will post on Piazza. Which brings me to Administrativa. Alex, Aaron, and I will be gone next week. All of us are going to Chicago for the visualization conference, which is of course very interesting for everybody who does visualization, but it's a shame for you guys because we're not here. So what happens is on Tuesday, let me see. Yeah, we do something that is related to your project. So next Tuesday, we do project peer reviews here in class. Our TAs, which will be here, have a sheet. They will hand it out to you that gives you instructions. I will actually post this sheet on Piazza pretty soon. And so the idea here is really that you come as a group, and you sit next to your group members from the get-go, and then you find some other group and you pitch each other your project ideas, and you critique each other's project ideas. And then you write this up in a PDF or a Markdown file and submit it as part of your milestone 1 for the project. Attendance for this one here is mandatory. I'll also post this, so everybody has to come. If you can't come, and if you're part of a team, you can write me an email and I can excuse you, but if you're by yourself in your team, there shouldn't be many people, so I think there's only one so far, then you have to be here. If you're online only, you're welcome to make arrangements to talk to somebody on Skype, but you don't have to do this. Any questions about this? Yep.
My partner is online, so do I just come in?
You can do this by yourself, or you can Skype him in. So, and you don't have to stay here in this room. So you can, can stay here in this room, but you can also wander outside in the hallways. The TAs will run around and answer any questions you have, and so on. Homework 5, the project proposal, is due this Friday. I hope almost everybody has a group. I got one email yesterday night, which I didn't reply to yet, that somebody is still looking for a group. Take this proposal serious. It will make your life much easier. It's part of your grade, it's part of your project. Think about it, and especially, I've said this many, many times, make sure you get the data and make sure it's usable. It doesn't help if you have 1,000 PDF files that you want to parse. You really have to have it in a structured format to get this project working. Any questions about homework 5?
I'm just curious about how long the proposal should be.
I don't remember the formal requirements. I think there's a page number on the website, but you should be, you should do a couple of pages. you should really show me that you thought about it. You should tell me about your motivation, about the features that you want to. It doesn't need to be like 8-point font and 2 columns and super dense, but just like you can have bullet points, of course, you can have lists, but you should really demonstrate that you really thought about it, and it shouldn't be like a one-pager. If it's 1 paragraph, it's definitely not long enough. And of course, this kind of like this page numbers excludes the many pages of sketches that we're expecting. Other questions? Okay. Homework 6, the most important one here is don't panic. I heard a couple of people didn't really quite yet get what this was about. So for everybody who is not super familiar with volume rendering and what is a transfer function, the Thursday lecture will be tremendously helpful. It would have been better if we had this earlier, like if we did this today instead of me talking here, but it just didn't work out in terms of scheduling. Aaron isn't here, and Aaron wasn't here last week. So Thursday lecture, he will cover this, and it will really be very helpful. And he will answer questions about volume rendering algorithms. He will talk about what is a transfer function and why do I care, and give you a brief GLSL how-to. And so really, like if you already want to get a head start on it, you can already start working on a transfer function. If you have no idea about what volume rendering is and what GLSL is, GLSL isn't super hard. It's a C-like dialect. So the big difference to JavaScript is, of course, that it's typed. You don't need to do anything fancy, and it's really just an algorithm. So you only need very basic control statements. You don't need any functions, objects, or anything else like that. But of course, you have to understand the basics to be able to implement the algorithm. So I thought I'd spend a little bit talking about the transfer function because I think that is maybe not very clear. And Aaron will talk about this in more detail, but I will just give you like an intuitive understanding so that you can start thinking about how you design your transfer function. So why do you need a transfer function? In a picture, for example, in a photograph, you don't need one because you have you actually do have one, but you have a clear assignment of an intensity value to a pixel. Let's talk about a grayscale image for now. So here we have like one single pixel, and we have like our sensor has a range from 0 to 100. So that I could simply linearly map this. 100 could be super dark, like black, and 0 is white. And that is nice, and that works, and you can create such a transfer function, just a pure linear mapping for volume rendering datasets as well. The problem is that volume rendering datasets or volume datasets very often have a lot more variations in intensity than you can easily display just on grayscale. So you could have, let's say, 1 million different values, or it doesn't really matter, the number doesn't really matter. You could have many different values for every single intensity pixel, for every single intensity voxel in this case. And the other problem that you have is that it's of course a 3D object. So if you just make every single object or every single pixel, just color it and make it opaque, then you have what you have right now, what is in the assignment. So you kind of render the outer hull. But you need to, of course, make this translucent, at least partially, or some parts of it translucent, so that you can actually see something. So let's say you have a low value, 0, or almost 0. If you map this to white, you will just see a white box. If you map this to completely transparent, that might be a good start. So what you actually have to do is, you have to define, like you have this scale of intensity values, and along this scale, you have for example, in the bonsai, you have different objects or different material properties that correspond to these intensity values. So you have, like, the pot of the bonsai tree has probably very high intensity values. So you would say, like, if this were the range, wow, much better. Yeah, okay. So if this were the range of your intensity values, you could think of, like, here is air. And here you would have leaves. Here would be wood. And here would be ceramic. Okay? So let's suppose I'm only selecting now the values that are in this region here, and I'm making everything completely translucent that is not in this range, and everything completely opaque that is in this range. I will only see the leaves. If I do this for this range here, I will only see the wood. And if I do this for this here, I will only see the pot. So obviously you have to do something else. And one option would be, of course, like this is green, this is brown, and this is red, for example. So you can assign these color values. And then, of course, this is not as clear cut. It's not just like values of exactly this value are leaves, but there is a range. And people have to find this range. And here, this histogram can be very helpful that we compute for you. Because the histogram shows you the distribution of the intensity ranges. And if you have a peak in this histogram, you could guess that there's a lot of material that has these intensity values in the data set. So what you could do, for example, is say, okay, this is green, I will give it 80% opacity. And please, this is not a transfer function widget, this is a conceptual design here. This here, I'll give it only 5% opacity. This one here, I only give it 80% opacity. But here, I set it to 0% opacity. So I don't want to have this, this area between here occluded. And then you could do like a linear interpolation between these points. And that could be your function. So, does that somehow help? I guess the fundamental idea is that you have more data than you can display with a single color scale, and that you have occluding data, so that you need to further work with transparency. And so, if you just you only need to pass this data, this essentially data structure into the volume renderer, and will actually do the rendering for you. So you only need to design a widget that actually lets you dynamically define the colors and where they're mapped to and the opacity values. And so this is a completely D3 only part, and you can do this now. You don't have to understand volume rendering. It's not going to look great, but you can still work on this really from scratch. Okay. Other questions about homework 6? Great, so I hope that after Thursday everything will be much clearer, and I think that Aaron will probably, he suggested it, but he hasn't really told me about the time yet, but he also said that he would do an office hour this Friday, I think. The problem is, of course, that we are both not here next week, but I'm sure it will work out. Okay, so I have again talked for quite a bit of time straight. I would like to do a design critique, which is also very much in line with today's topic. Can you pass that on this side? Oh. It's interactive, so pull out your computers. Does everybody have one, or the link is there? Is there some leftovers or? Yeah, sorry I didn't print enough. Just go to this link, there's the description, and it's actually interactive, so it's more about playing with it.
For civic engagement.
I don't even know how they calculate this stuff. It's something that I'm interested to find out, but it doesn't say.
Pretty much need to mind their own business. Yeah, it'd be nice if they did say how they calculate it.
Yeah, like what is the thing that determines? I notice is that the large majority of the world is not included in this.
Well, it has to be surveyable.
Yeah, it's only it's basically an organization that works with Europe and I looked at I didn't know what the organization was.
No Africa.
No Asia only talks about.
I never used their. I never used. Oh, but it's got South Korea.
Yeah, it's Japan's also based in US. 14%.
Well, you can't pick a whole country.
You can, I think. There is a thing I saw earlier that said compare the United States to other countries. For example, with like the Civic Engagement or one of these applications here at this park.
That started down. So then it rolls it up. That feels kind of uncomfortable to do it. It seems like this would be better. What's your question?
Yeah, it's visualization. I think it's just exploratory. I don't know if it's like research this. not, yeah, it's not like, you can like explore it, but you couldn't come to it, like, I don't feel like you could come at it with like a bunch of questions and have it answer them, because just sort of explore it and you're like, oh, okay. And once you see the visualization, then maybe you can ask questions about what's in it.
It's hard to quantify anything like that as well. So you can't really research it either. So it's really only exploration. Who's the audience?
I think it's supposed to just be the general public because it's presented really simply. Like they don't explain anything.
No hard details.
So here's the data. You can actually download the data from the data to give access to the data. It still doesn't say what the data, like calculation is. I'm assuming that the data that they give you is just the numbers and the scores they assign to them in various categories.
That's weird. That's all their data is.
What, really? That's the whole Excel file?
Oh no, wait. Oh, they've done a dashboard thing.
Oh, they made that.
Okay. So this isn't really useful either. You have to figure out how to parse through it and just get really complex. So they didn't design it to be mined. How do they make it matter to you? Does this matter? They try to make it so that you want to compare your region to others.
Yeah, they provide comparisons. By putting that comparison in there, by doing
Your
Started by having Scotland there before you.
they're trying to bait you with their fairness. What marks do the channels are used? Marks. Circles. Channels. How are multiple views used? Multiple representations of regions.
All cities are
So they have the map view is more for selection, showing you where in the world space is. And they have the view that gives a little bars for comparisons.
And they have these detailed views of score values.
The data partitioned just by region and category.
Okay, so
There's no more partitioning.
so what is really shown in this chart? Who wants to start? What is the data shown in this chart?
Regions of the world categorized types of.
Exactly. Different regions in the world. The regions are OECD countries. So why do you think is this, like, what is important for this particular visualization to make it matter to you?
Like, how does it make it matter to us?
Yeah,
The fact that you can like click on your own.
exactly. So you can look at your own and you can look at maybe the places you've lived before and compare them and so on. It didn't work for me now, but it actually should be submitting your location automatically. So whenever you open this page, for some reason it thinks that I'm in Japan right now, but generally that should work. And so that's how you immediately draw in engagement from people. So let's talk a little bit more about the data, these indicators. Has anybody found out how they're actually measured and what they actually mean? So what does, for example, access to services mean?
Well, yeah, something that like, I don't know, I felt like it didn't, because when it says, for instance, education, like the first thing I think of, oh, is like the quality, they must be talking about the quality of education there. But that's not true. They're talking about how many people in their population have more than a secondary education.
Yes.
And that's not a very good way to show how good their education system is.
So if I like rephrase what you're saying, it's essentially that these indicators are not fairly represented by the categories. Like education, sure, they measure here, they measure share of force, labor force with at least secondary education, but can you actually make an argument that this is a good proxy for education in general? Maybe, but that's kind of arbitrary, right? So there's another example here. Access to services. I would think, well, that's very general. That sounds interesting. It's easy for me to go to like government offices and so on, but it's actually only household broadband access. Probably not what I would have figured as access to services. Yeah, okay. So,
I gotta kick out of the fact that it gave Utah a good record for environment because of air quality.
yeah, well, let's take a look. Environment, air pollution. Well, it must be, like, it's probably, on average in Utah, the air quality is good, not in Salt Lake City, though.
But that's because there's no one else anywhere else.
Yeah, which again, gives, like, lets us ask, how is this data collected? Is it really an average of all the states? And is this good enough for, like, having a large state like Utah or California? Can we throw it into one bucket and say, this is what this is like?
I was going to say that because each region varies, you have to find a common value across. Like a secondary education in the middle of Africa is outstanding, but in Utah, it's ridiculous not to get a high school diploma.
Yes, so this is it gets into comparability of complex entities like countries, or so this is a tough thing. You can try the best and you can be faithful about how you communicate it. My objection here is really that they give this very broad phrases and only have one single indicator for that. So I really tried to find out whether this is the only compound indicator here that I could find, or maybe there's another one. But they seem to be really just these indicators, and I tried to find out whether there's more, but it doesn't look like it.
You can click on the like help at the top, and it will take you to the employee manual, like the manual that they like explicitly describes everything.
Yeah.
But I feel like that was kind of useless. No one's gonna go through and like read it. Like they should have like a hover over.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the channels. So here are like, what are the different views that we have? Like we have multiple views. Like what are the views?
The map.
We have a map.
Color for category.
Yes, the color for categories. Category is actually redundantly encoded. What is the other one?
Label.
Label, the correct position is also correct, and the last one is? Length, not? It's angle in the star plot. So here, like in the star plots here, or these rose petal plots, or however you want to call them, and so here you're supposed to compare these flowers with other flowers that are kind of similar. So we had, you also mentioned color, of course, labels, of course, and then position, and position would be like the faceting into the various spatial regions here for access to services for these indicators and so on. Okay, so this is kind of like we've dealt with the how do we identify the categories with the identity channels. Let's talk about the magnitude channels.
Length.
Length, or in this case, you could also make an argument for position. What is this one here? That's position, yeah. And so here, this is interesting. Can somebody tell me what this actually means here? It's kind of a box and whisker plot, yes. And we'll talk actually about them in the aggregation lecture today, or well, probably next time. And it also, it has essentially, it's not exactly a box and whisker plot, but it shows us a distribution. And it shows us this distribution in two ways. First, it shows us the median. So it shows us some statistical information, then it shows us the top 20% and the bottom 20%. So they don't deal with quartiles and so on as you would do in stats, but they make it kind of more accessible. And then they map the intensity so that you can see that you can easily see the distribution here. And so what is nice about this intensity map here is that you could also see a bimodal distribution, which you can't really see with a box and whisker plots, but it goes too far. Like here we have a multimodal distribution, so we have many peaks. And that's hard to see with just a box plot. So, what do you think about the interaction?
I think overlaying it on the map made it a little hard to navigate. So if you wanted to compare something in Europe to the US, you can't.
Yeah, well,
You have to try and scooch around and figure out how to get there through your.
yeah, so this actually brings us to the next question, like comparison. I think that like would be a very common question for, okay, how does Utah stack up to Nevada? And safety goes down. Wow, that's a big difference. Civic engagement, by the way, is very low in Utah. Did somebody figure out why, or what it is, what they actually measure here?
It doesn't.
Yeah,
Says voter turnout.
just voter turnout. I guess because it's just a solid Republican bank, nobody needs to go vote. Okay. Yeah, so I found comparison to be a little tough. So if you actually click on something here, you can compare the United States to other countries, but this only gives you like this global overview of like environment. For all of the other countries, you can't easily compare between two selected regions or something like that. There's one additional thing here, is the inequality across regions in an environment. So this like
That wording kind of makes me wonder if they're doing something else between when you do the comparison and just the normal ranking. Like, are they doing something to aggregate it in a specific way for certain countries? Or?
yeah, so I think this is really yeah, this is definitely something aggregated in addition to that. So like, what is the standard deviation for something like that? That is what's plotted here. I don't actually know what the data is, but that would be my guess. It doesn't tell us, it just says less equal and more equal. So any opinions about this visualization? Do you like it? Is it well done? What would you have done differently?
I think for its audience, which I assume to be like the general public, it's pretty good because it's not too detailed on like all the research aspects of it and things, and I think the common person's just not going to care anyways.
Yeah.
We already talked about it, but for something that's the goal is to compare things, they made it very difficult to compare things. Like we talked about having to drag the map around, not be able to toggle back and forth between two cities.
Yes.
You have to remember the length of all the.
Yes, you have memory over eyes in this case because you don't have multiple views. You don't have a way to actually either show them side by side, or you can't really. It would just be great if I could down here, if I just could highlight one single other state across all of this. That would just, like, easy operation would make it much easier to do comparisons. So there was a comment there.
Also, I think the radius of the circles can be made slightly smaller because if I hard to locate a place in, say, England, it is really hard. Everything is cluttered.
Yes, that's true. Like, the US is nice here, but if you go to other areas where there is like more points, like Mexico or in Europe.
Anywhere in Europe, it's hard to even decide where to go. So.
Yeah, I really have to zoom in. Let's compare my hometown. Well, safety is even higher than Utah.
Why is the environment so bad?
They measure air pollution, and that has a lot to do
Yeah,
with
so my
population
hometown
density.
is in a similar situation than Salt Lake City is. Like in a valley, we have inversion. And it's densely populated, so we have like a lot of people all over. I guess that makes it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I guess you could, if you could argue that, hey, well, there's this many more people here, so like, but maybe the output per person is way less in this area or something.
Yeah. So okay, the gist of this chart, in my opinion, is it's well done. It's a nicely done visualization for public engagement. I think that it's the biggest deal is the data and how it's collected and how it's represented. I think that is kind of the biggest issue here. So, but this is of course the toughest issue. You can set, like, one of you guys, after you're done with this class, you can probably do this visualization within less than a week. But of course, to collect this data from all over the world, that is the tough part. That is the labor-intensive part. So, but still, you should probably not represent it like this. You shouldn't say access to services if you mean broadband access. You should say broadband access. In terms of multiple views, because this is the topic, like the rest of the lecture, what I'll be covering, we have here small multiple essentially. Like we're faceting based on an attribute, and we see all of these again here. And they're linked whenever I select a state or an area, then I can see the corresponding elements in the others. Okay. So the last half hour, I will do a quick recap of views, and then we didn't finish this the last time. So I'll finish this up, and yeah, as I mentioned, probably filtering and aggregation will slide into the next lecture. So the idea of multiple views is really this eyes over memory. So that you trade display space for working memory, and so you actually show two plots faceted by whatever reason at the same time, and then you can actually make a comparison by just like moving your eyes around it and seeing that, whereas if you were to do this in a temporal separation, as we also mentioned, that you would have to actually track one point mentally. So it's really trading eyes over memory. And then we talked about linked views and linking and brushing. Here's the definition for linked views: multiple views that are simultaneously visible and lined together such that actions in one view affect the other. Well, I guess that's clear by now. The main thing about linked view options is encoding datasets, highlighting and navigation. And encoding here, this is the exam question, same or multiform. Dataset is share all, subset or none. And of course, based on this, you can span up a matrix. You can say same and share all. That's a little bit boring because it's actually just the same plot twice. You can say a different representation, shares the data. Sure makes sense because I can actually use the benefits of one individual visualization technique over the other. Subsetting is of course the small multiples examples. And if, or none. I don't know what the none does here. Okay. And then for highlighting is of course the question to link or not to link. And the only argument for not linking is you couldn't get it done. Practically, I don't really see, like, or you have no connection. Or of course you're in print. And then navigation to share or not. And for navigation, this is a little bit more specific. Then you would have these focus and context views with a little region and so on. And for volume rendering, this linked navigation is also very common. So usually if you have like spatial data, navigation is something that you have to think about. Multiform is when we have different visual encoding that I use between the two views, and I gave you this one example here where you could actually, like, these are subsets of a view, but you could simply choose which of, like, with these buttons here, you could click on any, like you could switch between those views. So these here are very highly aggregated views to show you just the average of this cluster. This is a parallel coordinate plot that shows you all the data. Here you have a histogram, and you can dynamically decide what you want to show. And yeah, the links here show the relationships between them, but that's not really what I wanted to show for this case here. The shared data case is when we show all the data in each view, but with different encoding schemes. So here we had this example of the matrix explorer. So we have these two fundamentally different graph visualization techniques. Matrices and not link diagrams both have their strengths and weaknesses, and in theory you could fix this by just showing people both of them. In practice, of course, it's a little bit harder than that, but that's the idea at least of this paper. Overview and detail is when one view shows the summarized information about an entire data set, while an additional view shows more detailed information about a subset of the data. So a common example here would be, I have a histogram of a data set, and then I show like one selected range of this histogram in detail in another visualization. That would be a good example. And so this is one of Mariah Maya's visualization techniques. So here she selects a subset of these chromosomes, and then she actually shows this chromosome here in more detail. So this actually, like you can see, the green patterns here correspond to these green patterns, and so on. This is an example of that. And it doesn't have to be just a histogram and bar charts, but it can be much more interesting, like you can see here. We also talked about small multiples today. So this is really about using the same visual encoding, but faceting the data, subsetting the data. And so here really you want to be able to quickly compare different parts of the data set. And this is the example that I mentioned earlier. We have a graph, so we have some, like these are kind of like smaller views. This is a large version of the same view. And here we show the same topology. You see the network is identical, but the attributes that are mapped to color in this graph are different. So you can see, for example, that the root, or this node at the top here, is green here, but it's white here. So you can actually compare between these different instances of the graph. And so you could, of course, also just switch through this in time, but then you again have to trade eyes over memory. Okay, space versus time, of course. So then we talked about partitioning, and this is kind of like we kind of got to that, but then we stopped pretty soon after that. So whenever you want to separate the data into groups, you're partitioning the data set, and this is a very, very powerful concept, and we'll talk about this when we are talking about aggregation. So you have a couple of design choices. How do you divide the data up between views? For example, give them a hierarchy of attributes. How many splits do you make? What is the order of the splits? How many views do you choose? And the partitioning here is typically categorical. So let's say I have a data set of students, and then I can split them by gender, or I can split them by master's undergraduate student, and so on. And based on these facets, I could simply compare them. Here is a population comparison, so we have different states. And so here, in this case, we have these categories, like the binned ages, so we are under 5 years, 5 to 13 years, and so on. And here they are ordered, they are split by state, and they are split by the age bins. And so here they are ordered by the states, and you can see like, that we have all of California here, all of New York here, all of Florida here, and so on. And in this case, they are actually ordered or grouped by age group. So you can see there is 65 years and over, there's this kind of variation, and the 45 to 64 years, there's this kind of variation. So these are just two different types of representations. So this is kind of a matrix alignment. So here we're doing both by state and by, we group by state in the columns, and we group by age group in the rows. Of course, this makes it a little bit more difficult to compare within a state, because we are substituting. What we're doing here is here we're actually using aligned position. So aligned bar charts, we're using the visual variable of position. So we can make very detailed judgments. So for example, we can say this one here is lower than this one here. Whereas this is a little bit tougher if you look at the California case. If you compare this one here to this one here, it's much harder to make this judgment. So these are the benefits and downsides. Like it depends on your task, which one is beneficial for this data set. Then I gave you this example of a trellis plot, where you have panel variables and partitional values, and we also do some ordering. So like fundamentally here, this shows you the, what was it? Barley yield in various areas. And this is divided by regions here, and then by the rows here are different types of barley. So you can see which region has how much yield in which time, in which year. So this column here is the year 1931. This column here is the year 1932, and then you can compare those easily. So this is faceted. based on that. So we can see, for example, that in 1931, the yield for this one particular crop was less than, or for these two here was much less in 32 than in 31. And then we can also make this comparison down the line here. So in this case, is sorted by group medians. So we would have the highest regions on top. And in this case, like we are using overlays instead of actually faceting. So here we use, instead of spatial encoding, we switch to color encoding. This is the 1932 case where we have the pink or violet color for the yield, and the blue one shows us the yield for 1931. And yeah, so depending on what your task is, can be more efficient. The problem is, of course, this one here you can do for a couple more probably and make it still easy. But if you want to do this, like if you have 10 years, you can still create a matrix like that. But if you have 10 colors, this will be a very messy plot. Okay, so I started talking about Hive, this hierarchical visual expression, and this is just like essentially these guys thought about how can we take this partitioning and slicing and reconfiguration to the max. And they're using a tree map idea. I'm just going to skip over that. I'm just going to give you an example of like the tree map of London here, and they have the partitioning attributes. Like this is a housing data set in London. And so we have the partitioning data sets of house type on the top level. So you can see we have the flat cluster, we have the semi-detached house cluster, and we have the terraced house cluster. Then we have the second division is neighborhood. So you can see here's Ealing, here's Brent, here's Enfield, and so on. The third division is sale time. So I assume this is like the order in or the order in here. Then we have these blocks have colors. So the average price here is shown as color, and the number of sales is shown as size. You can see that clearly that there's some quarters that are much more expensive than others. Yeah, and so I just wanted, this is a different partitioning. So here we have first level partitioning is neighborhood location, then neighborhood, then house type, then sale time, and then sale time per month. And I'm just going to show you the video because it's pretty good and cool.
Demonstrates how hierarchical layouts can be used to explore multivariate data through the reconfiguration using London property transactions.
That should actually work.
This video accompanies the InfoVis 2009 paper of the same name. It demonstrates how hierarchical layouts can be used to explore multivariate data through the reconfiguration using London property transactions as an example. We run through all the figures in the paper using the notation we developed to describe their states, the operators we use to reconfigure their states, and show how this can help us address research questions. Property transactions in this view are conditioned using property type and the year of sale. Rectangles are sized by the number of...
So we should be seeing something, I think.
This video accompanies the InfoVis 2. This video accompanies the years chronologically. This view more clearly shows the upward trend in average price. To increase the temporal granularity, we will add months to the hierarchy. We also recolor to reflect the number of sales. We call these calendar views. Years are arranged from left to right and months from top to bottom for each year. Purple is used to show the number of sales, which appear to vary seasonally. We expect there to be spatial variation in these data, so we will now insert London Borough into the base of the hierarchy and use orange to show average price again. There are marked differences in sales shown through size and price shown through colour between boroughs, but it's difficult to see how this varies spatially as all the rectangles are ordered by size from the top left, and the City of London has the least. The size order doesn't let us identify spatial patterns very easily, so we now rearrange the rectangles spatially and temporally. We can now detect some spatial patterns. For example, we can see that the highest average prices tend to be central and west of the centre, and that sales of flats dominate centrally, but less so peripherally. Rectangles are small where there are low sales, making it difficult to see the detail. In the next view, we fix the size of rectangles to show each with equal prominence. The detail of property types can now be resolved more easily, even where sales are low. To study how much each borough differs from the average ratio of property type sales, we will hypothesize that all boroughs will have the average ratio of sales, establish this as a baseline, and then colour by the deviation of sales from this using a signed price statistic. This procedure can be used to test hypotheses. The diverging colour scheme shows blue for lower than the baseline and red for higher than the baseline, showing that flat sales dominate in the centre, but terraced and detached housing dominate in more peripheral areas. We will now remove property type from the hierarchy. These calendar boroughs show sales and average price by month within each year. As such, monthly trends by year are emphasised. To investigate the trend over the whole period, we will order all 108 months chronologically from January 2000 in the top left to December 2008 in the bottom right. This shows a rise in average prices over the period and a fall at the end. We will now assume there is no seasonal variation in sales and colour by the deviation from this baseline. We will now do the same for average price. The brown shows higher than average prices towards the end of the year, within the year. This is consistent with our findings so far. Note the trend appears to be reversed in 2008. We will now consider different granularities of space, starting with boroughs. This is a rectangular cartogram of boroughs sized by the number of sales and coloured by the end. The visual occlusion makes this view difficult to interpret, but it demonstrates geographical distortion from the previous view. We will reconfigure this to a Gasner cartogram with boroughs sized by the number of sales, preserving the geographical shapes as much as possible. We will now reconfigure to a conventional chord clef map. We will now look at the effects of spatial aggregation. Here, rather than using boroughs, we have gridded the data into grid squares of equal area.
Okay, so the point of this was really to show you the power of, like, what the choices, of all the choices that you can make. And so actually when they presented this at the conference, the guy that was giving the talk was doing this live. So he could really change all of these attributes in real time while he was talking. So this is really a very powerful idea and very powerful system. But for the purpose of this class, what it really is about is to show you all the different possibilities that you have of, like, how you choose your visual variables, how you slice your data set, how you position things, and so on. Okay. In addition to multiple views, there is another option that's called layering. So that is combining multiple views on top of one another to form a composite view. The idea behind that is, of course, that we see something in more detail. We can make it larger. We can make the view larger compared to when I have multiple views in the same space. But of course, we can't do this with every kind of visual encoding. The typical example is the line chart. And this is one of Minar's maps that shows economic data, cotton import from India to England, import to England, and something with my French is rusty, récolté, I don't know, but something with America. On top of each other. So we could show this in 3 different charts, right? We could show this as 3 different line charts, but of course, like in this case, it actually is nicer to have it in one chart because we have the same scale, and they don't really occlude too much. So we can easily map this in one single map. If we, however, have a little bit more complicated examples, so here for 2 or 3, that is okay. Like if we have about 30 or 40, that isn't, well, you can still get the idea, but suddenly, like here, it gets cluttered. So there's a limit to how much you can do. Of course, showing like this many line plots is also not as easy, but here is another example that you could do instead. You could use these spark lines. So these various, that would be a small multiple alternative to this. So here, instead of showing you this one giant mess, you would simply show like a matrix of these little spark lines. And then you could probably still identify easily all the high ones, all the low ones, and so on. So we'll talk a little more about this when we talk about tabular data visualization, but just here as a comparison. Yeah, this is a video that shows you that this is a combination of both. So here we have like this overlaid views. At the side, this is again one of our IS visualization techniques. And then we have a, like, this is the aggregate, the overlays for the row, and here we have to aggregate the overlay for the column. So we have both of this, these encodings, and of course here we have the individual cells that show you temporal data. This is gene expression data. But this is actually a pretty nice view because I can see every single thing in detail, and I can also see the larger trends. Like I can see, okay, here we have like this general, well, these are all pretty messy, but here we can say, actually all of them. So here we can see there's clearly two different trends. Like one group of elements stays high and one actually drops down. And of course we could do this here, but this like seeing this trend and how many items are affected and so on are more easily done here. Whereas of course, for if I want to understand the particularities of the cell S6G6, then I'm much better off as looking at the individual matrix cell. So this is the last slide. I have a multiple coordinate views, and I like to call this multiple coordinate views to the max. This is a visualization technique that we published last year at Infoviz, and the idea here is really that you give people like an empty canvas, and that they have, let's say, 10 or 15 related data sets or dimensions and so on, and you let them design this visualization just via drag and drop. And I'll show you the video.
Domino is an interactive visualization technique for extracting, comparing, and manipulating subsets across multiple tabular datasets. This video demonstrates Domino using a music charts dataset. You can download the demo version and the dataset at domino.kaleido.org. This is the main Domino interface. It consists of a Domino board and a block browser. The block browser shows a list of all loaded data subsets. Domino distinguishes between three block types. Partition blocks show categorical data like gender. Numerical blocks show numerical data such as the release year of the first album. And matrix blocks show item combinations like the count of #1 hits for each artist in different countries. Relationships are represented in different granularities and directions using lines and bands. Placeholders and live previews help to add new blocks. When dragging an element from the block browser onto the board, possible drop positions are indicated. When entering a placeholder, a live preview of the data is shown. By dropping the item, the selection is confirmed. Domino allows users to quickly create advanced setups. Blocks can be added. Visualization types can be switched. Blocks can be transposed. Sorted and enhanced with labels. This works not only for artists but also for countries at the same time.
So in this case now, this is partitioned by continent.
Domino supports different relationship degrees, ranging from strong, which preserves the order and the partitioning across blocks, to weak, where relationships are explicitly visualized, as well as different methods to show relationships on a block, group, or on the item level. Blocks can be scaled individually or all at once. Rulers convey the scales of different blocks. With Domino, we can create established visualization techniques, including scatter plot matrices, parallel coordinate plots, parallel sets, flexible linked axis, matchmaker, Stratomax, or connected charts.
Okay, so this is really like the idea of this framework was that we develop something and let people partition and remix and combine however they like. There are some challenges, of course. This is not super easy to use, but it's an interesting research area. And that kind of brings me to the end of today's lecture. Thursday will be volumes. Please remember to come, especially if you want to do well on homework 6. And next Tuesday, mandatory attendance for the group feedback. Thank you.